All right. Another issue with that race as biology conception is that groupings based on race often overlook significant ethnic differences between quote unquote the same people. So we tend to assume that race and ethnicity go hand in hand with one another, but that's actually not the case. And what we mean by ethnicity is that groupings of people that are based on cultural differences or similarities. So, do you have a similar language, similar religion, similar customs? All right. Basically, cultural similarity, that's what we mean by ethnicity. Whereas race, if you think of the traditional sense, is supposed to be defined on the basis of genetic similarity. And some examples of ethnicity would be Norwegian, Hmong, Persian, and Hispanic. And the problem with our racial category is that it does not do justice to these ethnic differences and how people that, even if we assume they are of the same race, they have shared genetic ancestry, that doesn't mean that these populations think of themselves as being part of the same group or would say this different ethnic group that's part of the same race, say that these are my brothers and sisters. They may think of themselves as very different terms, and they may think of themselves as being superior to this other group. All right, so there might be ethnic differences within the same, quote unquote, same racial group. And one way to think about this is, are all Asian people kindred spirits? Because in the US, right, we tend to lump people from just ge- uh, uh, the geographic area of Asian and lump them together. But there are vast cultural and ethnic differences between these populations. And in some cases, these populations have historically not gotten along with one another. There's been a lot of tension. And so some people who grow up over in Asian countries can be quite shocked when they come into the US and they're being lumped in together with populations that they see as being radically different from their own group. And so in the US, they're being told, you're the same as this other group. And in their minds, they're like, no, we're not. We're very different, right? They have a different religion. They speak a different language. They grow up in very different environments. So our racial categories are not sensitive to these ethnic differences. And there might be a temptation, say, or at least one area where we can see this and where people might be tempted to classify ethnically different groups into one category would be the idea of Latino, right, or Latinx. And if we think about this, that category encompasses very different populations that are living in very different circumstances, and we kind of assume that they have this kind of shared kinship and shared background, but they can grow up and live in radically different environments. So, just for one example, think of someone who's from the Dominican Republic or Puerto Rico, right? They're living in the Caribbean on islands and living in tropical climates, versus people from Bolivia who are living way high up in the mountains, all right? Just very different environments. So they're going to have very different kinds of food, very different kinds of practices and things like that, even though we lump them in all together. And over here we have Argentina, right? That's going to be another different environment and a very different place to grow up than, say, on a Caribbean island or in the mountains of Bolivia. Again, our racial categories do not do justice to these different subpopulations and the ethnic differences that can exist between them. All right, and then another issue is that race varies culturally. So if race was really rooted in biology, then we would be able to, it would seem to make sense and seem to imply that racial categories should be stable across different cultures. And that's not the case. So for example, as you saw in the fish reading, in the US, we define race in terms of ancestry and specifically hypodescent, Hypo meaning lower descent, referring to ancestry. And what that means then in the US, your racial category is defined by who your parents were, and you get the racial category that is the lower in terms of social status. And so, one famous example of this in the US, famous slash infamous, is the one drop rule, which is if you have any black ancestry in the US, then you are defined as being black because you're getting the hypo descent. All right. And the implication of this is that all children of the same parents have the same race, right? Because if I want to know your race in the US, then I don't look at you, I look at your parents. In contrast, in Brazil, race is defined more in terms of appearance. So appearance what matters. And so if I want to know your race in Brazil, I look at you, I ignore your parents. And the implication of this is that in Brazil, children of the same parent can actually be of different races, which doesn't really make sense in terms of our US category. That's because we define it based on parentage, whereas in Brazil, they base it on appearance. All right, and we can see these differences in the case of a couple of families. And so we're going to be talking about two families, and here are the 4 kids they have between them. In here, we have a combination of siblings and cousins. All right. And then the question is, who are the siblings and who are the cousins? And I think that if we ask the average person walking down the street, say, who in here are siblings, and then who are here are cousins, I think the siblings, they would say, well, this boy here and this girl here are probably brother and sister because they look similar. They have similar light features. And then this boy here and this girl here are brother and sister, because they both have darker features. And I think this is what I think this is a standard answer that we would get to this question. However, the reality is that these are the brothers, and then these are the sisters. Okay? So these are the siblings of this family here, and then the girls are the siblings in this family here. All right. And so what we have is a situation where we have 2 sisters who come from a mixed race background, both of them married, who appear to be white men. And as a result of that, they have children that have very different appearances. In some cases, they tend to have very light or white appearance. And in some cases, they have a more darker appearance. And that can happen just given the way genetics works. All right. But in the US, we would have to say that these kids are the same race. And we would have to define this child here as either being black or mixed race. And the same thing over here with this child, given how we define race in the US, because we're going to look at the parents and think in terms of hypodescent. Whereas in Brazil, it's not an issue for these siblings to be defined in different terms and it be placed in different categories. And all of this is just to speak to this point that how we define race has varied culturally and historically. And if you look back at some other populations, like the Greeks and Romans, didn't really worry about race or think about race in any significant way. In the US, I think we've mentioned W.D. Du Bois before, but one of the very most famous and one of the founders of American sociology. And he was growing up in the time of Jim Crow, so he realized that he's facing a lot of racial prejudice in the U.S. But for part of his time when he was going to graduate school, he studied over in Germany. And in Germany at the time, they didn't have the conception of race, or at least their conception was very different from the one we find in the US. And he found that experience to be quite liberating because people didn't think of him in the same way, and he wasn't facing the same kind of discrimination there as he is here. And so one implication of this is that we our conceptions of race, because they do vary culturally, is something that can be changed over time.